Imagine walking and talking with Jesus himself like the disciples did. If Jesus were walking on the earth today, would you qualify for his inner circle? How would you compare to those famous 12? We'll consider that next on Grace to You. While you might expect the early disciples to have been larger than life, natural-born super saints, the biblical record tells a far different story. And that should encourage you. After all, if Jesus used ordinary people to turn the world upside down, couldn't he use you at the very least to influence your family, your friends, co-workers, and neighbors? We'll find out just how useful a servant you can be on today's Grace to You. John Macarthur, president of the Master's College and Seminary, continues his study about Jesus' disciples. It's called The Master's Men. And now with today's lesson, here's John Macarthur.
Let's turn to Matthew chapter 10. Now, we've been focusing then, as we have begun to look at chapter 10, on the training of the 12, the Lord's methods, techniques, principles, as he calls, trains, develops, sends out his apostles. This, in chapter 10, is really their first sending. Their final and official sending comes after the resurrection and the ascension. This is a preliminary sending, which basically is an internship for them. They go out, but not very far, and not alone, but rather 2 by 2. They go out a little while and they come back to him, and they learn in the process of field experience, later to be sent individually after he has already gone. And they ask the right questions when they come back, and their training becomes more intense in the months that follow this, their internship. Their leader was Peter. That is why it says in verse 2, the first Simon, who is called Peter. He is not the first one called. The first one called was John, and associated with him Andrew in that initial encounter in John 1. Peter was not the first one called. He is first in this sense. It is the same word used in this statement by Paul. I am the chief of sinners. It means the foremost one, the primary one, the chief one. Peter was the leader. He was the out front, up front man. And so last time we studied Peter and his leadership ability and how the Lord refined and developed Peter into a leader that was useful. Remember, I told you there are always 3 groups in every list of the apostles. There are 4 lists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts, and always in all 4 lists, there are the same 3 groups with the same 4 names in each group. And so we're looking at group 1, and it is the most intimate group. Group 2 is the next most intimate, and group 3 is the least intimate of the 12. The Lord himself could not get close to even 12 men, but he could get close to 4, and out of the 4, particularly 3. And so we're looking at this most intimate group. All came from the same town, all had the same profession, and all were in the first group called to Christ. And we ask ourselves this question, and I want you to keep asking it as we look at these 3 names. What kind of people can God use? That's the issue. What kind of people can God use in his ministry? What kind of people can change the world? What kind of people can preach the gospel of the kingdom so that souls are saved? What kind of people does God ordain for his purposes? Now, usually when we think about Peter, Andrew, James, and John, we have that view of stained glass saints. People who are on a completely different plane than we are. We name cities after them. St. Peter's, or St. Petersburg, or St. Andrews, which is a city in Scotland, or St. James, which is a common name for cities. And do you know there are more people in the United States named John than any other name? It's a wonderful name. And Peter and James and Andrew, we name people after those names with great respect because these are respected individuals. Cathedrals are named after these individuals. And we think of these particular four as something other than ourselves, in a different dimension of time and space, in another world. They have an aura about them. Frankly, that's really not the way it ought to be. They're very common men with a very uncommon calling. But they're very much like we are. And they demonstrate to us the kind of people God uses. See if you find yourself among them. Last time we learned that God uses people like Simon. Impulsive, dynamic, impetuous, strong, initiators, bold, who very often talk a better game than they play. The dynamic kind. Oh, he uses those kind. But let's meet the second in the list. Andrew, his brother. Andrew, Peter's brother. By the way, his name means manly. He, too, was a native of Bethsaida, that little village in Galilee, and he, like his brother, was a fisherman. In fact, in Matthew 4, he was down at the sea when Jesus came along. He had already met Jesus. He had already believed in Jesus. He had already affirmed him as the Messiah. But after going back to his fishing, now the Lord appears again to him at the shore and calls him permanently to follow, and he will make him a fisher of men. Prior to coming to follow Jesus Christ, he had been a pious Jew. He had been a godly Jew. He had been a God-fearing Jew. He had also been a disciple of John the Baptist. In fact, it was one day at the message of John the Baptist that his life was changed. For John the Baptist saw Jesus in John 1 and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." And Andrew was there that day along with John, who was also a fisherman and surely an acquaintance as well as was James. And he and John heard John the Baptist say that, and they followed after Jesus immediately. And Jesus turned and said to them, "What seek ye?" And they replied, "Where do you dwell?" And they went where Jesus dwelled, and they spent the entire day with him. And those hours were the crisis in their spiritual history. And when they came out of that day spent with the Lamb of God, immediately it says that Andrew opened his mouth and said these first words, "We have found the Messiah." No sooner did Andrew discover the reality of Jesus Christ for himself than that he announced to his brother Peter that very phrase, "We have found the Messiah."